This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there.
From Innistrad to Shadowmoor, what spooky top 10 does Nitsuhone have in store?
Hello everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and it is Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. It's the month of October, and that of course means all of my top 10s are Halloween inspired. Last Friday, we looked at the best creatures in the game to bring back from the graveyard with reanimation spells, and in past Octobers I've looked at the best reanimation spells. And in past Octobers, I have looked at the best reanimation spells as well as creatures who can constantly come back from the graveyard all on their own. The theme of bringing stuff back from the dead goes really well with Halloween, but in this video, we're going to look at the best ways you can protect yourself from opponents who are bringing their creatures back from the dead. This could be pretty useful if you find yourself face to face with a zombie apocalypse. The cards I am talking about, of course, are cards that hate on the graveyard. What did I consider graveyard hate? Well, anything that can hinder an opponent who is trying to use their graveyard as some type of resource. This includes a wide variety of things that mess with the graveyard, such as exiling cards from it, or making cards in the graveyard unable to leave the graveyard. Graveyard hate is a crucial aspect of many formats because Reanimator decks, and other graveyard-based strategies, have been pretty popular throughout much of the game's history. In this video, we'll talk about the 10 graveyard hate cards that have found the most success at Magic's highest level of competition. There are some cards I chose to exclude from consideration for this list that I want to mention, things like Scavenging Ooze, Deathrite Shaman, Anafenza the Foremost, and Kalitas Traitor of Get. These cards accrued a lot of points, but they got most of their points just because they are highly efficient creatures that do powerful things, and they get a little bit of incidental value out of the fact that they also hate on the graveyard. Alright, before we jump into the top 10, a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. Pro Tour and Mythic Championship top 8s, as well as Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix top 8 is worth 1 point. Now let's look at number 10. At number 10, it's Ravenous Trap, which can exile an entire graveyard. 4 mana for that effect is a bit steep for a lot of formats, but because it's a trap, it has a trigger that can let you pay it for a lot less mana, in this case, 0 mana. And against most decks interested in using the graveyard as a resource, it's going to cost 0 a lot of the time because graveyard-based decks are going to be putting multiple cards into their graveyard on a regular basis. The fact it is instant speed and 0 mana a significant chunk of the time makes it very powerful, as you can use it in response to reanimation spells or anything else your opponent tries to do with their graveyard. Exiling the whole thing can be backbreaking for a lot of graveyard decks because they spend resources loading it up in the first place, and if you take away all of that fuel, a graveyard-based deck is going to be in trouble. It was played in the sideboard of extended zoo decks where it was primarily brought in against dredge decks, probably the best matchup for Ravenous Trap overall, because dredge decks use the eponymous mechanic almost every turn to put several cards into their graveyard. It has also been effective against dredge decks in Modern, where it is also frequently brought in against Izzet Phoenix. It has also been used against dredge decks in Legacy, and it's pretty effective against Threshold and Reanimator there as well. Vintage is where the trap has been played the most though, where it is of course great against dredge, but also storm decks, which try to utilize Yawgmoth's Will to cast everything in their graveyard and get their storm count high enough to kill you. Casting Ravenous Trap in response to Yawgmoth's Will is frequently game over for those decks. Like most of the cards on this list, it is still seeing play now, and that's not going to change anytime soon. At number 9, it is Bazooka Bog, a land that exiles an entire graveyard. Adding an ability to a land is pretty nice, as it gives it far more utility than a regular land has. It might come into play tapped, but a land having an effect that is this game-altering is pretty rare. It also helps that it isn't particularly easy to counter short of stifle-type effects. Obviously, against many opponents, it doesn't really do a whole lot, but there are plenty of decks whose plans are at least slightly disrupted by exiling their graveyard. Bazooka Bog tends to be played primarily in decks where a singleton copy of it can be tutored up at the moment you feel like you should do something about your opponent's graveyard. In Extended, it was played in decks that ran Knight of the Reliquary, which could even tutor it up at instant speed, making it particularly powerful. In Modern, it can be found in decks featuring either the Knight, Primeval Titan, or Life from the Loam. It works pretty well with Loam-based Dredge decks because they tend to mill most of their library and use the graveyard as a toolbox, so while those decks don't necessarily tutor up the land, they can pull it out of their graveyard when they need it. In Legacy, it has also been used alongside Knight of the Reliquary, but more recently it has found a home in lands decks, which are loaded up with toolbox lands which can be tutored with crop rotation. Lands decks are doing pretty well in Legacy right now, and Bazooka Bog could potentially move up the list in the future. At number 8, we have Extirpate. Bazooka Bog and Ravenous Trap both exile an entire graveyard, but Extirpate only exiles a single card. It comes with a split second mechanic, which means that as soon as it is on the stack, nobody can put anything else on it, which effectively makes it uncounterable. While exiling a single card isn't quite as devastating against some graveyard-based decks, the fact that it also rips every copy of the card out of the opponent's hand and library is pretty nice. It saw a good amount of play in Time Spiral Block, a format that was dominated by Mystical Teachings decks. Extirpate could hate on the graveyard by removing the powerful card with Flashback, while also taking away every single other copy of the card your opponent has, which went a long way towards derailing the plans of those decks. In Extended, it was used against graveyard decks like Gifts Ungiven, Psychotog, and Life from the Loam Dredge decks. All three of these decks were very focused on using their namesakes, and they all sought to load up the graveyard, making Extirpate particularly potent against them. In Legacy, it has been used against Reanimator and Storm, like several cards on this list have been. Unlike the majority of this list, though, Extirpate has not found a whole lot of success lately, with its last Premier Event Top 8 coming back in 2015. That may not bode well for the card because so many other graveyard hate cards are actively putting up points. And number 7 is Nihil Spellbomb, another card that can exile an entire graveyard. In the case of the Spellbomb, if you have some extra black mana laying around, you can even draw a card. That means that if you use this in response to any sort of card that targets something in your opponent's graveyard, you are getting a 2-for-1, since now their reanimation spell does nothing, and you net a card in the process. In Standard, it was particularly useful against zombie decks, which ran cards like Gravecrawler, who just wouldn't stay dead. It was also good against Unburial Rites Reanimator decks. It has been played in Modern since the beginning of the format, where it is best, of course, against decks like Dredge, but also has some nice value against some other key Modern cards like Snapcaster Mage and Tarmogoyf. In Legacy, it is useful against Reanimator decks, and it sees play in Vintage too, where, as we've said, this is a great way of messing with Yawgmoth's Will. It is going to continue to add to its score in the future. At number 6, I have Ley Line of the Void, another card that sends cards to exile, but it does it a bit differently than the other cards we've looked at so far. Ley Line of the Void can't exile anything that is already in the graveyard when it comes down, but it makes it so that none of your opponent's cards ever go to the graveyard once it is in play. While it might cost 4 mana, that is almost never what people pay for it, since like all Ley Lines, you actually get to begin the game with it on the battlefield if it's in your opening hand. This can be a nightmare for a graveyard-based deck who suddenly has to find one of the few cards in their deck that can deal with this thing, otherwise they're going to be packing it up and going home. One of the things that makes Ley Line of the Void so appealing is that unlike some of the other effects we'll see on this list as we move up, it isn't symmetrical. This means that you can run this in your graveyard-based deck's sideboard to be brought in against the mirror. Graveyard-based decks are relevant in most formats, and as a result, the Ley Line has been played in pretty much all of them, except Block and Standard. In Extended, it was useful against the very first Dredge deck that ever came into existence, which was mostly built around Icarid, which is an example of a graveyard deck that ran Ley Line of the Void in its own sideboard for the mirror. In Modern, it has been a key graveyard hate card since the beginning of the format, and the same is true in Legacy and Vintage, where the card sees play on a regular basis. At number 5, it's Rest in Peace, the first card we've seen on this list not to have a black color identity. Rest in Peace combines the effect that prevents any cards from entering the graveyard, like Ley Line of the Void, with an effect that also exiles the entire graveyard. That is really great. The only downside this card really has is that it is symmetrical. So if your deck is interested in doing anything with the graveyard, you might not want to run this as a graveyard hate card in your sideboard. In Standard, it was useful against zombies and Human Reanimator, and in the non-rotating formats, it is used against lots of decks we've already mentioned, with Dredge and Reanimator being the most notable ones. At number 4, it's Surgical Extraction, which has a very similar effect to that of Extirpate. While it doesn't have split second, it comes with something that might be even better: Phyrexian Mana. Widely considered one of the most busted mechanics ever printed, Phyrexian Mana makes this a free spell. Meaning, even if your opponent is tapped out, they might be planning on casting this to disrupt your graveyard shenanigans. In addition to that though, perhaps more importantly, it means that any deck can run Surgical Extraction, and as we'll see going up the top 4 on this list, they are all cards that can be played in any color deck, unlike the other cards we've looked at so far. I mean, Nihil Spellbomb can technically be played in any deck, but you don't get the full benefit out of it without having black mana. Anyway, it makes sense that cards that can fit into any sideboard would be in the top 4 of this list. We don't need to go in depth about the various strategies that Surgical Extraction interferes with. We talked about all of them when we talked about Extirpate, but suffice it to say, it sees a lot of play in all of Magic's non-rotating formats, with Legacy being its most frequent home. Surgical Extraction is rapidly putting up points, including 22 in 2019 so far. At number 3, it is Tormod Script, the oldest card to make the list, but thanks to reprints, it has had multiple runs through formats and is legal in Modern. The Crypt costs 0 mana, which is a heck of a deal, since it can exile an entire graveyard. You can, of course, leave it in play with a plan to use it in response to an opponent trying to do stuff with their graveyard, which tends to be the more powerful thing to do, but you can also just get rid of the graveyard right away if you want to. It didn't see any play in Standard as a result of its first printing way back in the dark, but this is largely because there wasn't really a super graveyard heavy deck in existence at the time. That wouldn't really happen until 1998, and Tormod Script was printed in 1994. However, subsequent reprints in Magic 2013 and 2015 gave it some time in Standard, and it did put up points there between 2012 and 2015. It still didn't do a whole lot there, though. There just weren't enough reasons to be running the Crypt for it to be a consistent performer. However, in formats with larger card pools and far more powerful graveyard decks like Dredge, Storm, and Reanimator, it has been an indispensable sideboard card for a very long time. It's another card that's done a ton in 2019 alone, already managing 20 points this year. At number 2, it is Relic of Progenitus. A 1-mana artifact, the Relic allows you to make sure nothing too scary is in the opponent's graveyard by allowing you to remove a card from it once a turn. Then, in an emergency, you can exile their entire graveyard and also draw a card, which, like with Nihil Spellbomb, can mean that you get a 2-for-1. Because it can basically cycle itself, Relic of Progenitus has actually seen a fair bit of mainboard play, more than any of the other cards on this list, since in a worst case scenario, like you're playing against an opponent who doesn't care about their graveyard, it can at least still replace itself. However, in some formats like Modern, where the Relic has most of its points, there are so many decks that are interested in doing things with the graveyard that it's actually more common that you end up playing against someone who the Relic is actually pretty good against. And because of that reasonable fail case, it isn't unusual to see someone running 1 or 2 of these in Modern mainboards. It is another card with over 20 points so far in 2019. And at number 1, by more than 100 points, it is Grafdigger's Cage. It's also the newest card to make the list, which means it is seeing play at a far higher rate than the other cards we've looked at. The Cage has somewhat more specific graveyard hate than the other cards we've seen. It doesn't exile the whole graveyard, or exile any cards at all really. Instead, it specifically doesn't let your opponent bring creatures from the graveyard into play, and doesn't let them cast spells that are in their graveyard. While that is somewhat more limited than most of the hate cards we've looked at, it is enough to interfere with most graveyard-based strategies, since most frequently, casting spells from the graveyard and reanimating things is what those decks want to do. Storm decks cast things from their graveyard, Reanimator decks bring creatures back from the graveyard, and Dredge brings creatures back too, and it stops all of those pretty effectively, and for only a single mana. Unlike most of the cards on this list, it actually saw a fair bit of play in Block and Standard. Both were formats that featured cards with flashback, reanimation spells, and creatures with the Undying mechanic, and Grafdigger's Cage stops all of those things. The Cage is a great colorless hate card that disrupts enough decks that it is the graveyard hate card that has been played the most in the entire history of the game. It also gets my vote for being the most flavorful graveyard hate card. Well, that does it for this spooky MTG Top 10. Hopefully you learned a few good ways to keep the undead from causing you too many troubles. Before I go, I want to say that if you've been enjoying the better editing and awesome intro animation, you should consider donating to my Patreon. Any amount you donate, even $1, can help me pay Mike from Mythic Tales to continue making these videos look awesome. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that other people can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see the top 10s from the past, you're in luck because I have a playlist for exactly that, and it contains over 200 of them. So you should see that on your screen now. Thanks for watching.